So again, thank you for coming. We are really proud to present this presentation from Rick Levine, The Astrologer's Role as an Agent of Change. And as I was saying before, Rick has been really involved in many different organizations. He's been a professional astrologer since 1976. He's lectured throughout the world extensively and is a founding member of Kepler College. He's the former president of the Washington State Astrology Association and is an ongoing supportive member of OPA, as well as other astrological organizations. Rick continues to support astrology while sharing his insights, knowledge, and poetry with the world. You can find Rick's information at stariq.com as well as tarot.com. And about Rick's lecture today, Rick, do you want to go ahead and start now and explain to them what you're about the quantum theory, about what is going on with your presence in the world of astrology and why you chose this topic?
Sure. Good. So is this my official start?
Yes.
Or? All right. Well, here we go. I'm going to put on the webcam here just for a moment. So even though I can't see you,
you look perfect, Rick.
It'll feel like you can see me. All right. So it's like doing radio or television. I know you're all out there, and I see a lot of friends out there. Good morning. Good morning to Norway and Israel and to the United States and to wherever else you are that I can't tell yet. And so normally when we do presentations, we astrologers, we normally talk about subjects that are in fact either technical or astrological in orientation, and yet OPA is a little bit different because in OPA we actually address issues of being an astrologer, being a better astrologer, doing astrology professionally. And one of the things that interests me is the role that we play as astrologer in the world. There's all these things about, being an astrologer and seeing clients and doing that kind of work, but there are other issues that are involved. And I've had a few things that happened just in this last few weeks that I'll talk about that have really brought these issues to bear. And it's interesting that it's been said that a doctor or a psychologist will attract the patients that have the same issues that he or she, the wounded healer, has. And just a few weeks ago, I had an incident that I'll talk about a bit more extensively in a moment that really brought home this issue, this problem of what should our role be. And so I've picked this as a topic just because it's something that is close to me, and I think whether or not you've thought about it individually, it's something that merits real thinking. So away we go. I will probably get rid of my video webcam feed here, which I'm messing with, adjusting. I guess that's okay. I do have some PowerPoints or some slides, although they're really more of a guide to keep me on track. So I cover the things that I want to cover. We may deviate from them a little bit, but that way you won't need to be distracted by my physical appearance. And it seems a little bit unfair because I don't get to see all of you. So, but then again, we will have some open discussion because this topic, again, it's not what I'm going to be saying is more food for thought, and some of this will be my thoughts and my opinions, but it doesn't mean that it should be your thoughts and your opinions. It's just that I'm suggesting these are things that would be valuable for all of us to talk about. So I'm going to take my audio, or I'm going to take the webcam off. I think it might just be a distraction, but it was a good way of connecting and checking in. And I'm going to stop sharing that. There. That way I can go back to picking my nose and doing those things that you don't want other people to see. Kidding. All right. So the topic that we have today is the astrologer's role as an agent of change. And with a little luck here, I'll figure out how to make my next screen happen. There we go. So the opening question is, what does it mean to be an astrologer? We think of being an astrologer as someone who has a particular role. Most of us, not all of us, are actually counseling astrologers. And as we know, however, there are many other types of astrologers. One can be a research-oriented astrologer or a financial astrologer, or a technical, I guess that would also fall under research, or just it's a hobby and an interest. But for most of us, we think of being an astrologer as someone who actually communicates on a regular basis with clients. The question, though, is, and Carol, there still is there's feedback coming from someone or something banging around I can hear. I don't know whether others get that also.
Yes, Rick, I'm hearing that, and I'm looking to see who's unmuted. It looks like everyone's muted on my side. However, if you are on the phone and it looks like you are unmuted, if you could go ahead and press *6. From my view here, it looks like everyone is muted.
Got it. Okay. We'll just go on. It's
Thank
weird
you.
sounds that happen from, from the Matrix. So anyhow, this idea of being an astrologer has really changed, and part of the change is facing the old belief, the old illusion that astrologers are detached from nature, from reality, just as it used to be thought that the scientist doing an experiment is detached from the experiment that he or she is doing. And we're going to come back to this concept a little bit more in depth, but I want to lay the groundwork here, and in truth, until I hit the next the advance button on this, I'm not quite sure what my next slide is, so bear with me here. There we go. That's perfect. So the question that we will be asking, the question that I have asked myself, the question that I suggest we would all benefit from asking ourselves is this: should astrologers take positions, and that's taking positions on any sort of issue that is cultural, that is religious, that is economic, that is about relationships. We'll get to all these different pieces or these different issues. But the question is, do we show up as neutral, or do we show up as actually having a point of view? And for some people, this is a really obvious, the answer is really obvious, but I think that it's really important to break this question down and understand where we individually stand on this question, because it impacts the work we do, it impacts our clients, and wherever you fall on this, I think it's important to actually give it real thought and to think through what some of the ramifications are. So I mentioned earlier, before we officially started, that I had an experience recently, and I'd like to share this experience with you because it's something that brought home this particular topic. You know, we submit these topics weeks, months, sometimes over a year in advance, and then as it creeps up, we look at the topics that we submitted, and often it's like, oh my God, I submitted that as a topic and I have to talk about it. Well, this one actually is one that has become more important to me over the months. And as some of you may know, I do amongst the other things that I do, I do a monthly event at a local coffee house here in Redmond outside of Seattle, Washington, at a place called Soul Food Coffee House. And this little monthly thing, your month ahead from an astrological standpoint, I've been doing it for 8-9 years now. I did it for 7 years with my now deceased astrology partner, Jeff Jower. And for the last 1.5 years or so, I've been doing it on my own. And this is done in front of a live audience of usually between 50 and 100 people or so. And then it's posted on YouTube. And on YouTube, last month, I think the numbers were somewhere around 55 or 56,000 people watched that particular video. And there's a place on YouTube for comments. And so, so people actually can either write in wonderful, lovely things about me that feed my ego, or they can write in shit that's real that makes me think, oh man, did I say that? Or they can bring up topics of discussion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I go through these topics, these comments, and I usually respond to them as best I can. There are many people who simply sign on to these events and go, I'm a Libra from Barcelona, how's my love life or whatever. I mean, I guess these are to a larger, more generalized audience. Well, last month, actually, let's see. So the one previous to the one that's up now is September. So in August, I spent some time looking at. Normally, I just look at the transits of the charts coming up, and in August, by people's request, I spent a little bit of time, not much time, but a little bit of time looking at the charts of Hillary and Donald. Why do we call her by her first name, and him usually we say Hillary and Trump? Anyhow, I spent a little bit of time looking at both of those charts. At least, with Hillary is the best, to the best of our knowledge, her chart. And I talked about the chart just in a very superficial, kind of overview. I had the chart up and I talked about some of the specific things. And my intent wasn't necessarily proselytizing or convincing anyone, of one candidate or another. Although my feelings came across pretty clearly, because without getting totally involved in the political issues all over again here, this whole political scene is just a total embarrassment as an American to all of you who are here from other countries. Just know that there are a lot of us here in America that are just looking at horror at this whole thing. Now, having said that, I think that part of my point was that regardless of their charts, and I said this kind of in passing, that Hillary, even if you're an anti-Hillary person, all the stuff that she's getting, some of it is probably gender-related stuff, and that she's probably not any quote-unquote worse than any president we've ever had, from all the things, the baggage that she brings to the candidacy, but that Trump is actually substantially different than any candidate we've ever had, and that he was born on a full moon eclipse with, Uranus conjunct the sun, blah, 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 blah. And I wasn't really into a Trump bashing situation, although quite frankly, I could be, because when it comes right down to it, it's less a political issue than an issue of, for me, responsibility and hate, misogyny, narcissism. And that's basically what I said. Anyhow, I don't want to go in too deep into that, other than the amount of comments that I got was extraordinary, and most of the people who ultimately came out of the woodwork to agree with my perspective were mostly in response to the hateful stuff that came to me, both online and in private email, that was criticism and dismay and anger that I would step out of my role as a neutral astrologer who, in the words of one of the people that commented, that is channeling divine spirit and actually have a point of view. And that, of course, there were many people who believed my point of view was misguided and wrong, and that, you know, and that Donald was the savior for the country, and that Hillary was a child killer, and, you know, and a lesbian, and a whatever, you know, you've all heard it all. Well, the point is that this really made me do some serious thinking, and I addressed it because I am 4 planets in Aries and the North Node in Aries kind of a person, and in this month, in September, I basically addressed it with my firm belief that astrologers can, in fact, strive for neutrality in certain situations, but that I'm a human being, and that I don't give up my human beingness and my perspective as a human being showing up as an astrologer. I do not have to step out of my individual perceptions, belief systems, and values to do the astrology that I do. However, I do need to make my perspectives clear, meaning that I don't want people to think that I am unbiased. And it's not just when it comes to presidential elections, it's to many things. And we'll dig down in these in a bit, and the danger that we can, well, the problems that we can create if our clients or our audience assumes that we are neutral. And in fact, we have an agenda. Because I would suggest on most issues, most of us have agendas, whether we're aware of them or not, or whether we're overt with them or not. And I basically addressed the level of, I mean, I can't tell you how many emails and comments I got saying, I watch you every month and I'm never going to watch you again because now I realize you're just a, you know, another liberal pig, you know, who, you know, isn't, I mean, again, you know, you all know the drills. And I responded on YouTube by telling these people that one of the blessings of living in the United States of America, oh yes, there are curses too, is that we actually do get to speak our perception, our point of view, without necessarily fear of being locked up or hauled off. And that all those people who were adamant about I was wrong, misled, and so on, that they have their perceptions and their points of view, and when they post them on my YouTube channel, I'll leave them up as long as they're kind, as long as they're not just lots of mean innuendos talking about, you know, how misguided, or how, well, that's not even it, how horrific, how evil people are who don't get it or whatever. And because I think that diversity is in communication is important. However, it's my YouTube channel. And if you don't like my point of view, don't watch it. because I do have a point of view, and I'm not going to set that point of view aside, but I will come out and try to be very clear about what my point of view is so that you're not misguided thinking that I have neutrality when in fact I don't. So this particular experience really brought home for me a lot of the issues about what role do we play as agents of change as astrologers on an individual and a collective level. Now here we need to delve into our first real kind of what's the word, issue for the day, and this is based upon and I don't have the description of this lecture, but I know that I referenced this whole thing of objectivity and how that's changed in the world of quantum mechanics, and I want to address that for a moment. Historically, an individual would come to a diviner for divine interception, for divine awareness, and they would get a quote-unquote reading or a message about who they are, where they're going, what's right, what's wrong, what's going to work, etc. And when we go back to the ancient traditions, then they all have their various forms of divinatory interactions, or what's the word I'm looking for? Break, kind of where the divine breaks through through some sort of magician, priest, practitioner, whether it's with divining through human entrails or chicken entrails, or looking at the stars, or numerology, or I Ching, or omens of whatever sort. But it was always assumed that if you go to, let's use the astrologer as an example, that the astrologer is a separate observer of your life who will look at your chart and your life and say things about it, and from a detached point of view. And nothing could be further from the truth. It used to be thought by philosophers and by scientists that reality was something separate from individuality. In other words, if we go back to, if we go back to physics as it came to its fruition through the works of our main man, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, and on down to Isaac Newton, the physics, the science that we were given through that led us through the 18th and 19th centuries, that gave us so many of the breakthroughs and the ability to aim a rocket and land a satellite, or land a projectile, if you will, on a planet a billion miles away. This is all based upon the mechanics, the science, the physics of Isaac Newton. And in the Newtonian paradigm from which we come, whether we're conscious of it or not, we as individuals observed the universe that was a mechanical clock separate from us, and that consciousness had no place in the physics of Newton. In other words, time was a clock that was mechanical, and it went tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. Every second was the same, almost like a water wheel with the river of time mechanically going through it, so that there was no quality to time. It was just a constant measurement. That a minute was a minute, a second was a second, a year was a year, and that time was something separate from, called by a scientist, an independent variable. In fact, this also is the origin of what some scientists, philosophers, and humanists of the 20th and 21st century have called, the disenchantment of nature. It used to be that many of our religions and cultural orientations were such that we believed in animism, meaning that the universe was alive. And with Newtonian physics, the universe was deemed as not alive, that it was mechanical, and that consciousness was something that attached itself somehow, mysteriously, to humans as they reached a certain point in evolution. Now, that was fine until we began delving into the physics of the subatomic world. And I don't want to spend too much time. Many of you who have taken my classes or workshops know that this is a very key pivotal point of my own work. And this idea of quantum theory, and something that I actually have built into something I call quantum astrology, for lack of a better word, is the understanding and awareness that based upon quantum mechanics, that we are not separate from what we observe. That when we look at a subatomic reaction, the reaction, the act of observing something in the microcosm actually changes its trajectory. There is no way for us to make observations in the very, 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 very tiny universe, the microcosm, where we look at the interaction of electrons and protons and neutrons and other subatomic particles that create the zodiac or the zoo of subatomic particles. There's no way for us to look at them without actually interfering with them. My friend Fred Alan Wolf, the physicist, and if you've never read Taking the Quantum Leap, it's a great first book to really understanding what this shift was all about. But Fred Alan Wolf talks about going through the woods one day and meeting up with a tiny elf. And this elf is representative, so to speak, of the microcosm. And the elf invites us back to the elf home. And as we go in for a tea, Mrs. Elf and the kids are scurrying around. And yet as we enter the elf home, we're so big, just our size changes everything. We break out walls, we open the door, and the door falls off the hinges. There's no way for our presence in that tiny realm to not change everything. Just our presence alone, when we look at a subatomic particle, a photon has to be bounced off that subatomic particle so that we can see it. That's how we see things. And yet the size of the photon is large enough that it knocks whatever we're looking at off its regular trajectory. Now, it took someone like Fritz Capra, who wrote the book The Tao of Physics in the late 60s, early 70s, for us to really begin to understand that this quantum theory stuff wasn't just about the subatomic realm. That the fact of the matter is that when I show up in your life, or when you show up in my life, both of our lives are changed. And this is the most important thing for us to understand as astrologers, and that is that when someone walks through our door and we have their chart in front of us, when we have an interaction with a client, that client has changed. Our interaction with them has in fact changed their trajectory. We are no more separate from the lives of our clients and the cause-effect relationship of what happens in their life to how their future, follows. We are no more separate from them than the scientist is, in fact, separate from the material world. Quantum theory now understands that the universe, regardless of whether you're religious or not, the universe actually has inherent intelligence with or without the infringement of our consciousness onto it. And this is a huge switch In fact, Thomas More, in his book, The Reenchantment of Everyday Life, he's the guy who wrote Soul, The Care of the Soul and other books, and Thomas More, who is a very competent astrologer. He spoke actually, he was a keynote speaker at UAC I don't remember, maybe it was in Atlanta, can't quite remember. Anyhow, this idea that nature is actually alive and intelligent, and that consciousness is not something attached to physicalness. It arises mutually with it. And therefore, we as astrologers are always changing the trajectories of anyone who comes into our path. All right, let's move on. So we have the idea of astrologer as witness. The idea of doing a chart, and I look at the chart and I make pronouncements about it, and I'm witnessing my client from an objective point of view. We have the idea of astrologer as participant. As soon as I say to a client, well, I don't think that's such a good idea because you have transiting Saturn conjuncting your Mars this week with Mercury retrograde, and it might be better for you to wait a week or two to make this long-term decision so that you don't bring the current negativity that you might be feeling to the situation, or whatever it is we might pronounce. But as soon as we do something like that, we are no longer a witness. We're actually a participant in our clients' lives. Then we have astrologer as therapist. Now, this is the astrologer who, once they make that pronouncement of, I don't think this is a good idea, and the client then says, well, what do you recommend and how do we do this, and can I make another appointment with you and see you next week or next month and let you know what I'm thinking then and see how at that time. As soon as we create an ongoing relationship, we've now moved from just a one-time, kind of participant that interferes with someone's life to actually a counselor or a therapist, and many of us look at our, our work in that, from that point of view. I personally like to look at my client work as catalyst. In other words, I have chosen to take a route in my work as not a therapist. Or is that not as a therapist? My editor, where's my editor? The point is that many of my clients I only see once. And in fact, most of my clients I may see only once a year. I have clients I've been seeing for 10, 20, even 30 years. And I might see a client once a year or once every 2 years or twice a year, but I'm not with them on a day-to-day basis to actually work with them as they work through their changes. That's what a therapist would do. And I would heartily encourage most of my clients to work with therapists in their lives when they're in times of change or when they're in times of need. However, I see myself as a catalyst, which is different than a therapist. I'm the person that brings the reactive material to the inert substances that start a reaction that then plays on through. Now, I may be a catalyst even in situations that I don't know, and we're going to come back to that in a moment because that is a very key piece to this whole little story. I like to think of the philosophy of Burning Man, which just ended, and that is that no one comes to Burning Man as an observer. And I would say that this may be my philosophy in life in general, and that is even when we think we're detached, there are no such thing as observers. If we interact with something, if we see something, we've actually changed its trajectory and or our trajectory. There are no observers. We are all participants in this. And this idea that when a client comes to me for a quote-unquote reading, I am not observing that person. That person, that client has invited me as an astrologer into their life, and whether I'm aware of it or not, I am playing a role as an agent of change in that person's life. And if I don't have awareness of that, if I'm not conscious that that's what I'm doing, there can be negative consequences. All right, so as you look at the title here, the astrologer's role as an agent of change, often we think about change as social change. And whoops, that's missing a closed-in quote on the word social on the, for those of you who are watching the PowerPoint. We think social change. However, all social change is personal. In other words, the larger society's changes are reflections and amplifications of the individuals within that society. And so from that standpoint, everything that we do on an individual level has ramifications on a social level. And all that is occurring on a social level, we might say in ignorance, I don't care about politics, that's not me, I don't get interested, I don't get involved. But the fact of the matter is, when there are things occurring at that level, those things are reflections of individual issues. All right, we all have personal agendas. Every one of us, whether we admit it or not. And these personal agendas can infringe upon and can have ramifications in the work that we do with our clients. I reference a book by Carl Jung. It was the last book he wrote, a not very well-known book called The Undiscovered Self. And in this book, Carl Jung talked about how he believed that no amount of political maneuvering, no treaties would ever solve the problem of war. That peace would be found on planet Earth only by the salvation of the individuals within it. Now remember, Jung is the guy who said, bring me a healthy person and I'll cure him. So the fact of the matter is that what Jung was saying in The Undiscovered Self is that the horrific global social wars and strife that we see are projections of unresolved individual issues. And interestingly enough, this is very similar to the idea of Mahayana Buddhism, which basically says that we can all strive for individual enlightenment, but it's really until everyone is enlightened, no one's enlightened. And I like to phrase that as no one gets off until we all get off. And here I don't necessarily mean sexually, I mean off the wheel, off the karmic rounds. We're all tied to each other. And so we come back to the fact that when we do individual work, we're doing social work. And although I think it's important for people who are so moved to be involved in social agendas, whether it be through government or politics or agencies or protests or whatever work you might choose to do individually that has more social ramifications, the fact of the matter is that until we handle our own individual stuff, the social stuff is not going to get handled either. So I like to think of the work that I do with my clients and with teaching as acts of subversion. We can be as revolutionary or radical and or as plain Jane, non-interactive, inert as we want. But for me, as my belief as astrologer, as catalyst, and as an agent of change, when I am working with a client, the question that I ask myself is, what information can I give to my client that might in fact create some sort of catalytic reaction that might have that person in some way gain more awareness, that can give them more choices, that can in fact improve the quality of their life. Now, I'm not looking at making those decisions for my client. I'm simply looking at bringing the information to them that then sets them on a path where they can make those decisions for themselves. In the past, astrologers typically were employed by some sort of power structure. You know, if we go back in time, individuals did not see astrologers. I mean, look, in order to get an astrological reading from someone like Johannes Kepler, it took him weeks just to do the calculations of, because there were no such thing as an ephemeris. And so the people who had their charts done were people like Emperor Rudolph, you know, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, or the kings and the royalty. You know, John Dee was not out there, you know, doing charts for people walking by his office. He was under the employ of, you know, of the Queen of England. And so from that standpoint, the astrologer had an inherent agenda. And the agenda was to make the client, the patron, more successful. Because when the astrologer failed in his role, and I would like to say his or her role, but the fact of the matter, it was his role, because these kinds of divinatory sciences were reserved largely for the male. I like to remind my clients that astrology was largely created by guys for guys. But that's another whole story, and that bias is a very important bias. We'll touch on that in a little bit. So the point, though, is that as an astrologer to the king or queen or person in power, my fate as an astrologer was tied to that person. And there are stories of those astrologers who were not just fired from their job, they were fired from their life. They lost their lives for either making wrong predictions or for telling the king or queen or Hitler what he or she didn't want to know. But the point is that the role was not an unbiased observer. It was a person who had an agenda. And now we come to the modern astrologer and why it's necessary to actually make our agendas conscious. Because if we don't do that, we're actually having negative impacts. The part of the understanding of shadow work in general is the shining the light of the sun, if you will, by using the intelligence of Mercury as the psychopomp to go into the shadows, into the underworld, to make those things that are hidden, make them to bring them into awareness so that we can deal with them, we can work with them, we can manage them, we can be aware of them, because when things are hidden, they actually have greater ramifications that are not always the ramifications we think about. And so I think here it's important to understand that that there's a danger in keeping our agendas in denial. If you have an agenda, and whether that's working on an individual basis or with teaching a class or whatever, I think it's really important to know what your agendas are, and if those issues come up with a client, to make sure that your client knows that you have a point of view and you have a perspective, and that it's not just about your astrology. You see, one of my beliefs is, and as some of you know, even though I love the work that I do, and I've been doing it for, I'll probably pushing 50 years, not quite, but almost, we have some real problems as astrologers. And I know some of you have heard me say before that astrology shares a position with religion and science, and that is that both religion and science and astrology lead its practitioners into believing that they know more than they do. In other words, we as astrologers think we know more than we do. I would contend that sometimes being a good astrologer is not seeing the answer in a chart. It's being able to see what we think the answer is in the chart. And you see, here we have to be careful, because if I'm politically in favor of Donald Trump being the next president of the United States, everything that I see out there is going to support my belief. That every time Hillary does this or does that, it's going to support my belief that she's satanic. Every time Donald does this or that, it's going to support my belief that he's the savior of mankind. And or vice versa. And of course, as I said earlier, that's not necessarily my belief. But the fact is that when in the past, when we've had panels, as we will at the ESAR conference coming up in Costa Mesa next month, there will be panels of astrologers looking at the presidential election. And in the past, most astrologers tend to predict the winner of the presidential election based upon what they believe the politics should be. Now, I'm not saying this as 100%. There are astrologers, and we do try to maintain neutrality. But the point is that when we're not, I mean, this is about disclosure. And this is about, this is what I believe, but this is what I'm seeing in the chart, rather than just making astrology support whatever our belief is. So my question becomes, what are your goals? What are your goals in life? What are your goals for society? What are your goals when you sit down with a client? Because what your goals are actually determines what happens. Is it appropriate to project your goals, your desired outcomes onto other people, onto clients, onto students? Here we step into tricky ground because our agendas actually interfere with the agendas of others. If I'm someone who absolutely believes that that we should all be married once and stick with that for our life no matter what, and if a client comes to me then and is having issues at home and problems, rather than suggesting that they dig into them, one astrologer might suggest that they just knuckle down and bite the bullet and just kind of live with the world that they had created. I knew an astrologer, actually one that many of us know, who would never see a client that was having a relationship that was outside of a marriage. And this was something that he was very upfront with because it conflicted with his perspective. And I think that that's okay as long as you're open about it. It's not okay to bring your beliefs into a situation where the client thinks they're getting astrology and they're actually getting your perspective. So what are you going to do about all this? How does this change the work that you do? Anais Nin wrote, "We do not see things as they are, we see them as we are." And when we look at charts, we don't see the chart, we don't see the situation, we see it through our eyes. We bring our own core values to every session, and our values have bias. And we could dig in deeply here and have long discussions about social bias, gender bias, sexual bias, political bias. And by the way, gender and sexual are different. They are two separate issues. Political bias, religious bias, cultural bias, even physical bias towards height, towards weight, towards what someone looks like, whether they're have blonde hair or no hair or whatever. Professional bias, whether someone is a neurosurgeon or a trash collector. We bring our values to our situation, and not talking about them can do damage. I think perhaps one of the most important areas, and this ties our biases on sexuality, on gender issues, on religion and culture, all brought in together with the relationships and marriage, because this is such a big reason why people come to astrologers. And I'm not trying to sell any any one different point of view. I'm just saying that you have a point of view of what's good or not good. You know, if you've been through 2 or 3 divorces, and in each case your ex-husband or wife had a moon in Capricorn, and you have a client who walks in the door and he or she has a spouse with a moon in Capricorn and they're having marital problems, all of a sudden, whether you know it or not, your bias is probably assuming that their spouse with that moon in Capricorn is the same asshole that your 3 were. You know, and so this idea here of bringing our experiences into situations is really dangerous, and yet we have a role to play, but we have to bring our assumptions out into the open and put them on the table, otherwise we will be in trouble. And this isn't about changing your mind or your mindset, it's about being aware of them. Now, we have assumptions. I'm not going to go back through this again. We've talked about the quantum physics thing and the particle wave duality we didn't really delve into. I'm not going to go far into that today, but this idea of we have assumptions even that the moon is a particle, that planets are big, 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 big rocks, particles, and yet quantum physics would have us understand that particles and waves are different ways of the same thing presenting itself, and that although we think of the moon as a particle, it's also a wave that is 13 cycles a year, or Pluto is 4 cycles a millennium. And so this idea of duality brings in this issue of uncertainty. And this uncertainty then brings up the issue of fate versus free will. Many of you have heard me lecture on this in much greater depth, and I'm not going to go far into this, only to say that this idea of astrologer being an observer and knowing what the fate of a situation is went out the window, along with this Newtonian idea that mechanical reality is something separate from consciousness, and that at any given moment, fate and free will are both operative, and as an agent of change, we need to practice understanding where we are on that spectrum. And this, of course, brings up the issue of prediction and prophecy versus the idea of possibility and potential. I'll actually be talking about this, about how astrologers co-create reality, coming up at the ESAR conference. So this is a little bit of a pet area of mine. But I do believe that as an astrologer, in some ways, we are like high-potency homeopathic remedies. For those of you who know something about homeopathic medicine, you know that it's vibratory. And so, again, let's come back to this idea of someone coming into the astrologer with some marital issues. And we see that they have, well, let's say they have their natal moon at late degrees of Sagittarius. We know that Saturn right now is moving through Sagittarius. And we go, oh, well, as Saturn comes up to your moon next year, that might be a time when the marriage goes through some sort of change, and if things aren't working out, that may be a time when you actually choose to leave the marriage or separate, you know, because you might feel very, very detached emotionally from what's going on, blah, 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 blah. Now, having just said that, I have given my client a homeopathic remedy that is a vibration, very, very high potency. There's no physicality to what I just said at all, but what I said goes into the unconscious, subconscious of my client, where I don't have, where the client isn't even aware of that. And in the subconscious, homeopathic remedies, if they're a right vibration, actually build in power and can actually take down a physical structure. And so 3 or a year later, a year and a half later, when that client calls you back and goes, oh my God, you were right, my husband and I, my wife and I have separated and we're filing for divorce, you may have been the cause of that divorce by just the words that you gave as a homeopathic remedy that actually manifested or created the event. William Blake talked about our sense organs as doors of perception, and I think it's important to understand that when we're looking at a client's chart. When we're looking at the world out there, we're looking through our own chart, and that it's important to keep that in mind. Just a very quick word here that what I'm really digging into here is not about what technique you use. I don't care what techniques you use. I'm talking about the process. I'm talking about the engagement with the client rather than the individual technique. And yet we bring assumptions to a table, whether it's what school of astrology, what kind of astrology we practice, whether we think retrogrades are bad, whatever points we use. These are all assumptions that we make. And in fact, all these assumptions are exactly that. They're assumptions. And so if we come to a situation thinking that Saturn is a bad planet, then we're going to be an agent of change that is going to be a harbinger of negativity every time there's a Saturn transit, rather than understanding and working with our clients to help them understand how to use Saturn to create solidity and structure in their lives. So I think the ultimate goal here is making the unconscious conscious, because when we do that, we actually get to work with things rather than having them work with us. And I'd like to close before I open the mic up. I know we've just hit our hour, but in theory and practice are the same, but in practice they are not. The point here is that having all of our astrological ideas and theories are great, but we need to understand that as we're working in the world, whether we're working with individual clients or whether we're working as an advisor for someone who is actually in a point of power in their life, whether they're in politics or running a corporation, or whether we're simply like our wonderful associate Caroline Casey, who rather than calling herself an astrologer, she calls herself a visionary activist, and using the cosmic energies to actually bring about change on the planet. So I'm going to put my webcam back on here for a second. People can see me again. There I am. How frightening. And if anyone has anything here to say, I think Carol is in charge of unmuting the mic.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was fantastic. Does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and just put any key in that chat box, and your name will come up and I can unmute you. Or you can actually write your question in the chat box. Does anyone have any questions about Rick's presentation?
Is anyone still awake?
Yes, I think there are. I think you've given them so much to think about, Rick. Georgia says, kudos on this point and observation. Excellent.
Hi, Georgia. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you saying
No, you're good.
I have all these friends out there that I don't get to talk with.
Hi,
how
are you?
Okay. I'm sure in Costa Mesa.
Cute. Okay.
Aww.
Okay.
Ready to play.
I'm getting something from Jenny Chen. She said, Rick, your presentation definitely brings up a very good point. Thank you for bringing it up for us to think about. And Rochelle writes, great value. Thanks, Rick. Any other questions? I'm seeing lots of comments and no questions.
Well, I don't know if that's good or bad, but I hope you have questions, because if this, I like to think of myself, and I know some of you have heard me say this before, but I like to think of myself as the question astrologer, not the answer astrologer. When I have clients who come to me with a particular question, should I sell my house, should I get married, should I get divorced, blah, 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 I tell them that they've actually contacted the wrong person. It sounds like they're looking for the answer astrologer. I'm the question astrologer. And you'll leave my consultation knowing more about your question and maybe having more questions than you had when you arrived, but you won't get an answer from me, because I think that when we as astrologer answer questions, and I know there are those of you who totally disagree with me, and that's okay, but I believe that if I answer your question, it stops your process. And that even though I have damn good answers, I'm a good answerer, that at best You get my answer, not your answer. And so I am not going to answer your question. I'm going to help you think about your question. I'm going to help you understand the nature of what you bring to the question, the nature of the dynamics, astrological, that are on this particular point in time, but I'm not going to answer your question. So I'm hoping that some of you actually have more questions than answers. I mean, I love to see that you agree with me, but I'd rather see someone say, that's a pile of shit. This is all crap. Astrologers should. And that's okay. You can have that perspective. It's just not mine.
Mary has a question, and she wrote, how would you rephrase a second Saturn return?
Aha. Well, when you say rephrase it, for me it would be how would I phrase it? Because, you know, Saturn, see the thing is that working with Saturn is one of the most important tools we have, because Saturn is the gateway, it's the boundary between this world, between the material, the sensible world, and the extra sensible world. And whether it's a Saturn return or a Saturn conjunction or transit to any planet, the understanding is that Saturn's job is to help crystallize things and give them form. And so often Saturn transits are a test. I have a hard aspected Saturn in my chart, and Saturn often for me is the final exam that I forgot I was taking the course and I can't cram for the night before. But so Saturn basically brings up the things that need to be dealt with in order to gain the structure that we want. And a lot of people live in fear of Saturn transits, and yet Saturn, to quote my my friend Jeff, Saturn, excuse me, hang on one second. Jeff used to say that Saturn is the planet that says no but means yes. And I always used to have to say he doesn't mean like sexually or like setting your own boundaries. What he means is by that, or what he meant by that, is that where Saturn holds us back, it's usually because we have work to do in order to make it stable enough to have longevity or to have endurance. And so Saturn returns first or second. I mean, if someone's coming into their second Saturn return, I want to help them think about what happened or didn't happen at their first Saturn return. Because again, I see planets not as particles, but as particle waves. And once you understand that this is not about the moment of your Saturn return, it's about the cycle of Saturn in your life. So the question is, what happened when Saturn was in opposition to its own place, when you were adolescing at 13, 14, 15? What happened with the first Saturn return? What happened in your life when Saturn conjuncted and or opposed your sun each time, and or your moon? Because this then brings up clues as to how you relate to Saturn and what the issues are that come up. And the deal is that waiting until the event happened doesn't work. Waiting until the event happens doesn't work with Saturn. What works with Saturn is like an Aikido master who takes a punch and says, oh boy, look at this energy. I get to take this energy and work it through the system and ripple that through, and using that energy I get to do some change work. As opposed to the traditional Western boxer who parries and punches. And that's the way we often deal with transits, is by parrying, blocking, and punching. And yet, with a Saturn return, I think the key is to take that energy and say, what does this have to offer me, and how can I work with this in advance so it doesn't run me over like a deer in the headlights?
Thank you. Paula also has a question, Rick, for you. And she writes, do you believe there is a lower and higher expression of a planet in terms of vibration?
The simple answer would be absolutely. but there is no absolute. So relatively, I would actually, instead of using the words lower and higher because they are on a scale, I would use close, the inner and outer. That yes, it is. There is a there are different vibrations or different ways to work with the vibrations. You know, Mars and Saturn were considered malefics not because they're bad planets, but because sometimes the energy is harder to work with. And you know, we as humans unconsciously take the course of least resistance. A biologist would call this homeostasis. We just do what we need to do to keep things in balance. And so Mars is heat, and Mars is assertion. Something happens negative to Mars, Mars hits back. But that may be a lower vibration of Mars, where the higher vibration, the more elevated way of working with Mars may not be engaging in warfare, but actually using that to build one's boundaries and or to make one's case in a manner that actually has a positive manifestation rather than a negative manifestation. And so we have to be careful with these judgments. Yes, I think that there are multiple ways of working with everything. For those of you who have listened to any of my YouTube presentations, you know that one of the soapboxes I get on is the bullshit idea that Mercury retrogrades are negative. There's nothing negative about Mercury retrograde. There's nothing negative about any one planet. They're all just there. How we react and how we work with it and how we respond to it may be difficult. And in fact, a retrograde planet is just simply one that's louder. Retrograde planets go retrograde when they get closer to Earth. So Mercury, or Venus, when it comes between the Earth and the Sun, looks like it goes backwards. The important thing is not that it's bad, it's just that Mercury is louder, and so we tend to lose control because we have so much going on. We tend to make dumb decisions. We tend to react and do something without thinking it through. Anyone who says they shouldn't travel or shouldn't sign a contract or shouldn't get married on a Mercury retrograde, I think, is just buying into some crazy party line that is not based on reality, but is based on superstition. The idea that Mercury retrograde is bad is nuts. It's just the idea of reacting without thinking is nuts, and that is more prevalent when Mercury is retrograde. So the deal is, I mean, if one did not travel when Mercury was retrograde, I mean, we're talking 2.5 months out of the year. You know, for people like me who travel, that's crazy. You can't do that. The point, though, is that it may take more attention to details. It may, in fact, require that you think things through more because Mercury is closer and it's louder. And I just picked the Mercury retrograde because we're having a Mercury retrograde right now. And again, when a planet is louder, it means that often we shut it down. Just like we give Ritalin or an amphetamine-based substance to kids or grown-ups who are hyperactive, we make them more hyperactive and then it shuts down. And that's the way a retrograde planet works. So we need to work with them rather than parrying and punching back.
Thank you, Rick. Georgia has a question she'd like to ask it live. So Georgia, I'm going to actually unmute you. And it looks like you have muted your own mic, Georgia. So to speak with Rick, you're going to have to unmute yourself as well. It looks like you're on.
Hey, Georgia.
Hey, Rick. How are you? I hope I see you in October, right?
I certainly will see you.
Okay, so the comment I wanted to make, which is conjunct, is adjunct to what you said, and I think this is important because we're going into these conference seasons now. We're going to have ESAR, we're going to have Baltimore, UAC in a couple of years. I think what you said is really right on the money about biases that astrologers have sitting in panels. And I think we need to really be conscious of what you said because I've seen that for almost 50 years too. that we go in with our biases, we sit there and we say these things, and it's not really coming from the chart.
No.
And it makes me so mad. But I think that was such a good point, and I just wanted to tell you, you were able to speak what I've been thinking, and thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I think, you know, I'm not the only person or the first person to say this, actually, but it's something that I've spent, I think, more time trying to flesh out than other people have. I mean, we have, and we know that most astrologers, rightfully or wrongfully, most astrologers tend towards liberal, left
Right,
thinking.
right.
And we know, without naming any names, astrologers who are absolutely off the grid in, you know, conservative politics and right-wing thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I definitely have my biases, but I am also aware that those people who have those biases are sometimes frustrated with the astrologers who lean in one direction, but couch that in their astrology to prove their point rather than in their values.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you again. Thank you. Ellen has a comment, and she writes, "It's always interesting to me to see how we are always talking our charts. This talk is a perfect example. With Uranus transiting through your heavy heavily Aries oriented chart. This is perfect, I guess she meant to say."
Yeah. Hi, Ellen, and right you are. Except I've been talking about this. I've talked about this going back probably 10 years ago at an OPA conference down in Sanibel, talking about our need to understand our values. But you're exactly right. We not only talk through our charts. I once saw Nick Campion do a wonderful lecture in which he made the claim that astrologers don't look at other people's charts. They look at their own charts in other people's charts. When you look at someone's chart, the first thing you see is, oh, look, this person has Saturn conjunct my moon. Ah! Or this person has Uranus conjunct my sun. Wow! Or whatever it is. And that we, yes, I agree with you, not only do we speak our charts, live our charts, act our charts, but we also see our charts reflected to us in things out there, in people out there that we then either like or dislike, not based upon what's out there, but what's based in here, our own charts. I agree with you. Hi, Ellen.
And then Andrea also has a comment. She wrote, "I like his point of view. I have already faced the same situation. People get disappointed for not having the answer, but they're left with other questions."
Yeah, it's, you know, and again, it's something that I do before I see a new client. I don't want any misunderstanding. I tell a client in advance, this is what you're going to get and this is what you're not going to get. And what you're not going to get is fast, quick answers to complicated questions. And if you get them from someone else, I would suggest you run, because those answers are not going to be helpful for you. Now, if you still want to see me as an astrologer, that would be great, and I'd be glad to work with you, but I'm not going to answer your questions. And so let's get that out of the way even before we do the consultation. Otherwise, you're going to set yourself up for disappointment thinking that I'm going to tell you whether or not to do this. Ain't going to happen. So, yeah, it's something we deal with.
And then Alice also has a comment. She writes, "Hi, Rick, a great presentation. I have your
Hey,
quantum
Alice.
book from way back in 1993 and love it."
Ah, yeah.
And Rick, oh, I'm sorry. Do you still have your video on quantum theory?
Well, there is a video that's available through Gaiam or sacredmysteries.com called Quantum Astrology, understanding the cycles, history, the cycles and histories of astrology. But I think what Alice is referring to was a collection of essays that I published back in '93 called Quantum Astrology, and the subtitle of that was Essays on the Physics of Metaphysics. And that's actually not in print, but I am reworking that material, and I would expect that to be out in book form sometime in the next year or two. It's a fairly sizable undertaking, and it really is the underpinning of a lot of my work. Those of you who have heard me lecture, I mean, it's something that it informs pretty much all the work I do as an astrologer, is this understanding of the external world from a point of view of post-Newtonian quantum physics that is much more akin and aligned with Buddhism or Hinduism or some of the non-mechanical Eastern or Asian philosophies or psychologies.
Great, thank you. And then Angela Tiki, she wrote that there's a category of clients visiting a bunch of astrologers until they hear what they want to hear. Do you have any comments about that?
Yep, they won't be satisfied with me. You know, I think there are people who move through life basically looking for what they want out there. And if that client came to me, I might be a showstopper for them, because I would be the one that might help them begin to understand that as long as they're looking for their answers out there, they're A, never going to get the answer they want, and B, will end up wasting their whole life looking for something that's not out there. It's within. And yet, yes, there is that class of client. I would tend to, how do I want to say this kindly, move that class of client to another astrologer and perhaps not take them as a client, or make sure they understood what they were getting or not getting in advance.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation and giving us so much to think about. And you will be at ISAR, is that correct?
I will be at ISAR in Costa Mesa. I will be doing my annual retreat at Brighton Bush Hot Springs in January, up in the old growth forest of Oregon in January. I'll be in India, in Goa, India, doing a 9-day retreat on experiencing the spiritual dimensions of astrology. That's the end of January. And then I'll be at NCGR in Baltimore in February. And then I'll be with Kai Pacha and Maurice and some other folks, Sol and some other folks down Patricia Walsh, down in Costa Rica. So I'm going from Costa Mesa to Costa Rica, which I think is an upgrade. And that's next May. And all of these are, you can search them on the internet or find them or send me an email. I think you have a slide up right now that has my email address, rlevine@stariq.com. And by going to stariq.com or my Facebook profile page, you can get on my mailing list if you're so inclined. And yeah, I do waste a lot of time on social media, but it's the 21st century.
Yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your contribution to OPA. And OPA will be having a table there at the ISAR conference, so we invite all of you to come by and visit us. Rick, thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for joining us. And if there are no other questions, we'll go ahead and turn the recording off. And I think we've pretty much have it. A lot of thank yous, a lot of excellent presentation comments, Rick.
Well, good, and thank you all for, giving me this opportunity to talk about this stuff. I think that these are things that we don't talk about enough. Because, look, when astrologers get together, there's so much cool shit to talk about. We want to talk about charts. We want to talk about transits. We want to talk about political events. And yet there's a deeper issue that doesn't go away. And I think it's important that we make what's unconscious conscious. So thank you all, and thank you, OPA. And thank you, Carol, for doing this work. It's grunt work, and it's good stuff, and appreciated.
Thank you, Rick. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.